way we've done this is to split up the theme really into some sort of hazard-related adaptation. I'll just go back to this quickly. So I think where you lost me, I was just saying we've split the healthy and community resilience theme, sort of hazard-related adaptation priorities to do with heat, cold, pathogens, air pollution, and UV. And then the other side of the story, which is equally important, is the capability side. So we looked at the capability of the health and social care sector, the emergency planning sector, and we looked specifically as well in this theme about the capacity of people to recover from flooding. So the built environment chapter and the infrastructure chapters have looked at preparing for flooding, but this chapter really looks at what happens after a flood, after the initial emergency response, and what is happening to people in terms of being able to get back into their homes and recover mentally. So this is the sort of story for the healthy and community resilience theme, and I'm just going to stay on this slide for a bit because this really tells you most of what you need to know. What's striking about this particular chapter is that of all the themes we looked at across the NAP, this is where almost all the action that people said they were going to do has actually taken place. So we gave a sort of resounding green column in the middle to whether actions are taking place in the NAP and elsewhere. And that was quite unusual across the report, just to see the amount of activity that's underway. The impact that action is having, particularly for the bottom 4 rows. So you can see for the pathogens and the 3 capabilities and capacity sections, we really don't have enough information to be able to say how vulnerability to climate change is altering. Partly that's due to just a lack of data, but it's also partly due to the difficulty in being able to measure people and people's behaviour and people's health over time. And we can come back to a couple of those. I just wanted to talk through just a few more things on heat. So we've talked about overheating already quite a bit as we've gone through the slides, and these are just a couple more sort of examples really of what we're talking about. So one thing that we found very striking, which we talked about under this theme, is the understanding of the public of how the climate is actually changing. And as you can see from this slide, this is just standard Met Office data that's showing the number of hot days has, as you would have expected, increased significantly over the last 40 years. But what was interesting was that a survey that DEFRA conducted a couple of years ago called the Prepare survey, which some of you may have used and read. It looks at businesses and local authorities as well as sort of public awareness, but it found that most people weren't actually aware that the number of hot days was going up through time, and that it actually older, and we'd have more days with snow in the future than we would hot days or heat waves. Now that survey was undertaken in the winter during a particularly bad bout of cold weather followed by flooding, and what the survey concluded was that the weather conditions at the time were probably having quite a big impact on people's perceptions of climate change. But that in itself is something that we're quite concerned about, and we've said in the report, and also when the Environmental Audit Committee looked at the National Adaptation Programme as well, that really the government has not necessarily paid as much attention as it could have done to the issue of public awareness of climate change over the last few years. There used to be quite a sophisticated programme that focused on public awareness, and that's fallen by the wayside a little bit over the last few years. So one of the recommendations we've given is that the government should step up and give responsibility to a key department for increasing public awareness. And the chart that's just about to come up shows you some of the results from that survey. So what's really striking here, as I said, is actually that the lowest awareness is about heat waves and hot summers, and this chart is showing what people think might become more common by 2050. So the bottom bars, the green and the blue, show that the percentage of people that think these different hazards are going to become more common. And there's also a chart in the health chapter as well about looking into the past, sort of which hazards people think have become more common, and you get a very similar picture. Just sticking with the overheating story for another couple of slides, really, is some other indicators, so we've already talked about urban green space, and that's something we've focused on quite a lot in the overheating section. This one is just showing what's happening with different types of dwellings in the overall housing stock. So we looked at the sort of percentage of new home registrations over the last sort of 20 years, and that the red line on this graph is the number of flats that are being built. Now, as you'd expect, because there's such a demand for growth of the housing stock, and because there's a lot more single occupancy households, there's an awful lot of flats building going on, which is the red line, and a corresponding decline in the number of detached dwellings. Now, there's a lot of evidence which we've referenced in the report to do with the fact that flats are much more prone to overheating than detached houses or even terraced houses. So that's one of our other indicators. But what we'd really like to get to at the end of the day is some empirical evidence to show actual temperatures in homes and what's happening with those. And obviously that's very difficult data to collect. But a few studies have done sort of case study examples where they've gone into several hundred homes and monitored temperatures over the summer. And quite a few of those studies are all coming out with similar numbers, and that about 20% of homes are designated as overheating, and that's even in cool summers. So the last study that was in the report was looking at that trend in 2007, which was quite a cool summer, and you're still seeing a large percentage, about 1/5 of homes, being designated as overheating. Just before I come on to the key messages as a whole, the other issue I just want to touch on, because of some of the questions earlier, is about the public health sector. And here we were as interested, I guess, in what's happening with current planning for current weather extremes as we are with interests in future climate change. One of the reasons we were particularly interested in this is because almost half of the actions in the NAP are about raising awareness of climate change in the health and social care system and organisations. So there was an awful lot of emphasis on this in the Healthy and Resilient Communities theme. And as Dave touched on, the survey we conducted of different unitary authorities, and particularly JSNAs, found that only about 1/5 of JSNAs were considering flooding and heat as risks to service delivery, and that's now. That's not even considering future climate change. And that 1/5 was only looking at those unitary authorities that are designated as more at risk. So it wasn't all, but it was about 50. Other evidence, so some of you will be aware that under the adaptation reporting power, the Sustainable Development Unit, along with around 20 other organisations, has produced a report, and that's got some interesting sort of quantitative information as well. So that showed that about 60% of health and wellbeing boards are doing their own risk assessments and thinking about weather-related risks. But it also found that very few felt they really had climate change kind of nailed and were taking actions that would have an impact. And the overall conclusion of that report really was that the whole sector was at a fairly early stage of planning. And one thing we touch on in the report when we're looking at the capability of the health and social care sector is that we're still unaware of really any mandatory duties for the local authorities to report on the measures they're taking to increase the resilience of assets and services to extreme weather. So NHS core service providers do have mandatory duties to do that, but it doesn't seem that public health authorities do, so that was quite. On to the key messages, we'll leave a little bit of time for questions. So really, I've mentioned the NAP is really focusing on the awareness raising and research and providing guidance. And again, there's a lot more detail in the chapter on the impact that some of those actions have had. The main two findings really that we wanted to draw out the most are the overheating and the built environment story, and as Daniel and David both mentioned, there's the emergency planning sort of actions are there under the heatwave plan, but there's really nothing happening to increase the resilience of the built environment to overheating, particularly through the uptake of passive cooling measures either in existing homes or in the new building stock as well. And for other health-related risks, there's really very low understanding of the impact that adaptation actions are having and how vulnerability is therefore changing. And one thing we'll be doing over the next year is to have discussions with organisations like Public Health England, the LGA, about how we can improve that understanding and that evidence base. Daniel mentioned that PHE are just starting to undertake a new 10-year cohort study, which will look at how people are recovering from flooding. And DCLG already collect quite a lot of statistics on how long people are out of their home homes, and we know that there are still dozens of households who are out of their homes following the flooding in Somerset, but none of that data is published at the moment. So those are the sorts of conversations we want to have in the future. And really, the other area, I guess, is the evidence, which I haven't touched on as much. But for risks like air pollution, UV radiation, and pathogens, we understand something about how climate change drives those risks. But what we really don't understand is the combination of climate change, public behaviour, and land use change, and how those combine to look at those risks. And that's something that we'll be picking up quite strongly in the next climate change risk assessment, which Daniel mentioned we're writing the evidence report for at the moment.